This is the first of 3 videos in which we're going to go ahead and investigate the pulmonary system. And we'll start with an overview of the pulmonary system and then look at some anatomy. And so I like to break respiration down into 4 parts. And so we start by having the movement of air from the atmosphere to the lungs. And what that does is it brings in air that's high in O2. And as you exhale, you're exhaling air that's higher in CO2. This is what's known as pulmonary ventilation, which we oftentimes just simply refer to as breathing. Once we have the air into the inside of the lung, then we have to have the diffusion of CO2 from the pulmonary capillary across into the alveolus so that we can then exhale it. And we have diffusion of O2 from the alveolus across into the inside of the pulmonary capillary. And this is what's known as external respiration. And you might wonder, why is this called external respiration? And the answer is because anatomically, the inside of the lung is actually still considered the outside of the body. We still haven't had any movement across phospholipid bilayers. Well, once we've loaded up the blood with O2 and reduced the CO2, then it returns to the left atrium, left ventricle, out the aorta, and into the systemic circuit. And so now as it enters the systemic capillary, O2 will diffuse out and into the body cells, and CO2 will do just the reverse. It's been produced in the body cells, and so it diffuses across into the blood. And then finally, we come to the last part, which is just simply cellular respiration. And you know that the mitochondria will use O2 as the final electron acceptor. And in primarily the Krebs cycle, CO2 is produced. Well, which part of circulation is responsible for external respiration? Well, here's your hint right here. So if you think that it's the pulmonary circuit, then you're right. And so now the answer to this should be fairly easy. What part of the circuit is responsible for internal respiration? Well, that would be the systemic circuit. Here you can see the 4 parts of respiration that we just talked about. Here you can see exchange between the inside of the lung and the atmosphere. And so what do we call that? We call that pulmonary ventilation. Then we move on from there to the exchange between the lung and the pulmonary blood in the pulmonary capillary. Well, that would be external respiration. Then we move on to the exchange between systemic capillaries and cells of the body, and that is internal respiration. And then finally, we finish up with the use of O2 as the final electron acceptor and the production of CO2 in cellular respiration. And I want you to pause for a second and write down the overall equation for cellular respiration. And so the truth is that you've got the answer right here. I just want you to add a little bit of detail to it. And so C6H12O6 is glucose or fructose or galactose. And we break that down in the presence of O2, the final electron acceptor. Byproducts of that breakdown are CO2 and water. And then we also get energy from the foodstuff, the carbohydrate, and put it into ATP. Here you can see the 2 parts of the circuit that we just talked about. And so as we go out of the left ventricle and into the aorta, we go around to the rest of the body. And so there's the systemic circuit. And here, as we come out of the right ventricle and go through the pulmonary trunk, we go into the lungs where we dump off CO2 and pick up O2, and that's the pulmonary circuit. But now we're going to go back and look at the systemic circuit, and notice the branch here. And it's going up and it's going to the lungs. Well, you have to understand that the lungs are made from cells that are metabolically active, and so they're going through cellular respiration. They need O2 as the final electron acceptor, but they also produce CO2. And so they need their own part of the systemic circuit, and that's what you see right here. This is the bronchial circulation, which again is part of the systemic circuit. Here, as we come out into the veins, where we're low in O2 and high in CO2. And now, rather than returning that blood to the right atrium by going through the superior or the inferior vena cava, notice what we do with it. We actually bring it here and we dump it into the pulmonary vein. And so the net result of that is we're taking blood, which coming out of the lungs has a partial pressure of O2 of 100 millimeters of mercury, and we're diluting it just slightly. So now as that blood moves back into the left atrium, the partial pressure of O2 is actually a little bit less than 100 millimeters of mercury. It's about 95 millimeters of mercury. And so again, here you can see that the lung is actually receiving its own pulmonary circuit. Remember, it gets all of the cardiac output, all of it. And then it's getting a small portion of the systemic circuit, which we refer to as bronchial circulation. All right, why do we ventilate the lung? And you know the major reason that we ventilate the lung is actually to exchange the respiratory gases. The respiratory gases are O2 and CO2. That's what they are. And so again, we need to bring in fresh air that's high in O2 and then breathe out to get rid of excess CO2. Well, as we force air up through the vocal cords, they vibrate and they create sound. And then we use our lips and our tongue to kind of convert that sound into understandable language. And so ventilation also helps to support speaking. And then a third thing that it does is it actually helps to control blood acidity. You know that that is a regulated variable. Homeostasis is keeping the pH in a nice tight range. pH of blood is slightly basic, about 7.35 to about 7.45. Well, how does breathing affect this in any way? And the answer is the carbonic anhydrase reaction. And here you see that carbonic anhydrase reaction. CO2 in solution will combine with the water to create carbonic acid. Well, it's an acid, it dissociates to release protons. And what's left over is the bicarbonate ion. And so there you can see, if we increase the number of protons, then we're going to make the blood more acidic and pH goes down. Don't forget, more acidic, lower pH. Well, okay, so here's the question. How can you make your blood more acidic? Do it. And if you said, okay, what I need to do is increase CO2, which will force this to go that direction, all I need to do is hold my breath. That will build up CO2, and so what will happen is you get the combination with water and you produce more carbonic acid. That will dissociate and produce more protons. And so you're making it more acidic. You're pushing the pH down. Now, the next piece should be easy for you to answer. How can you make your blood more basic? Well, again, what you need to do is decrease the amount of CO2, and that's going to force the carbonic anhydrase reaction back the other direction. And so what you have to do is you have to hyperventilate, breathe more deeply. And what that's going to do is as the CO2 goes down, protons will recombine with bicarbonate to give us carbonic acid, and that will break apart to CO2 and water. And so there you go. Hypoventilation. Holding your breath is just an extreme example of hypoventilation. Hypoventilation means you breathe less than normally. That causes a respiratory acidosis. Now, technically, it has to be alveolar hypoventilation to indicate that we need to breathe deep enough to get down to the gas exchange region. Okay? Well, what that's going to do, again, as CO2 builds up, it causes an increase in the partial pressure of CO2. And if you can push that up to 42 millimeters of mercury or greater, then we say that you have a hypercapnia. High carbon dioxide levels, hypercapnia. Well, again, on the other hand, you hyperventilate, and it should be alveolar hyperventilation. You've got to be breathing deep enough to move fresh air in and out of the gas exchange region. That causes respiratory alkalosis. And if we do that enough, then that's going to cause a decrease in the partial pressure of CO2. If we push that down below 38 millimeters of mercury, now we have low blood carbon dioxide or hypocapnia. Now, the last thing that can happen is that the lungs help with regulation of hydration and blood pressure. And we've talked about that. And so you should think about it a little bit and see if you can remember what happens there. Think endocrine. All right, and so if you think of the lung, remember the lung has angiotensin converting enzyme, and it changes angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2. That stimulates the production of aldosterone. Aldosterone is going to cause reabsorption of sodium at the kidney. Water follows salt. Don't forget our little saying, water follows salt. And so that helps to recapture water before it gets lost in the urine. Well, don't forget that blood pressure is directly related to how much plasma you have. Well, if you have more fluid, you have more plasma, higher blood pressure. And if you have less fluid, then you have less plasma and lower blood pressure. So that's how it relates. Okay, here are some data that you can look at. VE is, in fact, ventilation. How much air am I exhaling in liters per minute? And so that's what you can see. And here, this is resting energy expenditure roughly. It's just a tad bit high maybe, but not too bad. And those of you who have taken the Intro to Kinesiology class, you know that energy expenditure can be expressed in VO2 in liters per minute or as a percent of your VO2 max. When you're exercising at 100% of VO2 max, that's a pretty high intensity, and you can only keep it up for a couple of minutes, 2 or 3. And because it is high intensity, you fatigue and you slow down. 80% of VO2 max is still high intensity. 60% is more moderate, and as we get down to 20, that's actually pretty light exercise. That's like a brisk walk, maybe walk up a slight slope or something like that. So now you need to look at these data and come up with a conclusion. Pause the video. What's your conclusion? And so if you said something along the lines of the more energy required by the body, the higher ventilation will be, then you got it. That's exactly right. And the reason that is because you're accelerating what metabolic process? Answer that. And so I hope you said cellular respiration. Yes, if you accelerate cellular respiration, number one, you need more final electron acceptor. And number two, you need to get rid of more excess CO2. So not surprising that as energy expenditure goes up, you're going to breathe more. Another way of stating that is just simply to say, ventilation is directly tied to metabolic rate. Okay, and so now we're going to go ahead and look at pulmonary system anatomy. What's the beginning of the pulmonary system? It starts right here. And so the nose and the mouth are the beginning. And so as we look here, you can see that what we have right behind the nose is the nasal cavity. And there it is. And what we have down below that, you oftentimes will breathe through your mouth as well. And so there we have the oral cavity. And then behind the nasal cavity and the oral cavity, we have the pharynx. It starts up there and it goes all the way down past the oral cavity. We continue down and we go to the larynx. And this, again, is where your voice box is located and the vocal cords. And so that relates to speech. Then we connect it to the trachea. And then finally we go down. This is actually this junction where the trachea splits is what's known as the carina of the trachea. And then the tubes that branch off and go into the lung are the bronchi. This is the left main bronchus. Over here, you can't really see it, is the right main bronchus. Now we're going to look at a little bit more detail. We're here in the upper respiratory tract. In the skull, we have these bumps in the bone. Okay, they are covered with epithelial tissue, but these are what are known as the conchi. You've got 6, 3 on the right side, 3 on the left side. The one up near the top of the nasal cavity, not surprisingly, is the superior concha. The next one down is the middle concha because it's in between the superior and the inferior concha. And so this is the one that's down the lowest. And so there you have the 3 concha on the right side of the nasal cavity. You'll have 3 on the other side. These conchi are covered with pseudostratified ciliated epithelium, which is also covered in a layer of mucus. And we'll talk more about that later. Very important. What is it that's found just below each of these conchi? You can't see it, but back in there is what's known as a meatus. Well, what is a meatus? That's a review question from anatomy of the skull. And a meatus is a passageway or an opening that leads to the interior of the body. Okay, and so now here you can't see the meatuses very well in this picture, but here they are. So here you see the 2 superior concha on the right side and the left side, and there, right behind it, there's the meatus, okay? And I want to say, oh, they've colored it olive green, but it's really snot green. That's what it is. We come down here. Here are the two middle conchae, and there you can see the meatus behind each one of those. And then finally, inferior conchae and the inferior meatuses. And so you have 6 of those as well, okay? Well, we already answered this question. A meatus is a passage that connects to the inside of the body. And so what is it that is connecting here? Come back up here. Look, here are the paranasal sinuses. And then in addition to the paranasal sinuses, you have lacrimal and nasal ducts. And these things all drain. They build up fluid, especially if you have a cold, or if you have allergies and they're particularly bad. And those things will drain into the meatuses. That's what happens to all that stuff. So it goes there. And so now we've answered this question as well. And so those sinuses and those nasal and lacrimal ducts drain into there. Okay. Here we're looking again at the same section. And so we're looking at a frontal section and looking at the right side of the nasal and oral cavity. And again, what is it that's behind there? Well, it's the pharynx. The upper part, the part that is behind the nasal cavity, is the nasopharynx. Well, not surprisingly, the part behind the oral cavity is the oropharynx. And then finally, we move down to the laryngopharynx. And so there it is. And the laryngopharynx, and the pharynx is the common opening to what? Not surprisingly, we're talking about the pulmonary system. It is going to lead to the pulmonary system. Oh, but look right here. This is also the passageway that food and drink will follow to get down into the esophagus, as you see there. Now, when you swallow food and water, your epiglottis should fold over to prevent all of that from moving in and going into the trachea. So there you go. We go from pharynx to trachea. Okay, well, we have these upper respiratory tract passages that we've just been talking about, and they conduct the air down to your lungs and back out again, but they do other things too. And now that mucus that's in here becomes important, because one of the things that these passages do is they filter air. Every time you take a breath in, there are particulates in there, whether you're in an area that you think is polluted or not. Now, they're far worse if you're in a polluted area, if you're in China, if you're in LA, something like that. But those particulates, as they come in here, the conchae now, which are also known as turbinates, make that air swirl around. It makes for turbulent flow as the air moves back here. And that ensures that the air bumps up against all of those mucous membranes. And that makes a lot of those particulates stick, because mucus is very sticky. The other thing that's happening here as they hit up against these tissues of the body is they tend to get warmed up. That's true certainly for us when we live in a place like Greencastle. On the other hand, if you lived in Tucson during the summer months, you're actually going to cool the air down. You know, if the air's 120, you cool it down to under 100 degrees. And that happens fairly quickly, certainly before you get down into the lung. You could never inhale frozen air. It doesn't happen. And then the third thing you have to do is you have to saturate the air with water vapor, 100% humidity. Now, in Greencastle, it's not unusual in the summer for us to be breathing in air that's 70, 80% saturated or even more. But again, if you're back in Tucson, it might only be 5 or 10% saturated. And so that's a lot of water vapor that's being taken from these cells to saturate it, and you can't recapture it. When you breathe out, that water is gone. And so this represents a significant source of water loss. The other thing that I'll point out to you real quickly here, the green tissue that they show you, those are the tonsils. And so there are the palatine tonsils and there are the lingual tonsils. I don't know why they didn't put in the green up here and show you those pharyngeal tonsils, but they're a quick review of the lymphatic system and some immunity too. Okay, now we're moving down, and so again, we look at the larynx, and so we've talked about larynx overlaps the laryngopharynx and extends from the base of your tongue Stick your finger way back there. It might make you puke, so don't do that. Down to the trachea. And so you can see the trachea down starts there. Okay, and you can also see, I mean, it's not great, but these darker rings that you see are actually rings of rigid cartilage. And so you can see that here as well. Why is that? Well, this is an important tube, and we don't want it to collapse. And so that rigid cartilage helps to keep it from collapsing, except when there's a pretty strong force. So it can be collapsed, and that's really, really painful. And it's also kind of dangerous, okay? And then, as you've already figured out, the larynx connects inferiorly with the trachea. So yeah, there it is, right? So you already had that answer there. And you know, the trachea too has these rings of cartilage around it as we look at that, okay? Now, again, there's that carina that I already mentioned over here as well. And what we find there are lots of sensitive nerve endings. And the importance of that is when you breathe in irritants, they stimulate those nerve endings and they cause you to cough to try to get rid of those irritants. Now, the other thing I want to tell you about the cartilage real quickly is it only goes around the sides and the front of the larynx and trachea. Well, why might that be? And the reason is because the esophagus is going right down behind this, and it's pressed right up against it. And when you swallow food, it expands into the back of the larynx and trachea. Okay, and it would be harder for that to occur if these were complete rings of cartilage. All right, and so again, there's the larynx, and actually, voice box is up in there. Force air through to create sound. And then there's the trachea, and then finally, we're going to move into the bronchial tree. And I want you to notice the similarity with the bronchial tree and the arterial tree. As we move, we diverge. More and more branches that get smaller and smaller and smaller. And so what we have here is the left main bronchus. Notice how it doesn't quite reach horizontality. I don't even know if that's a word. Is that a word? But at any rate, this helps to ensure that as air comes flying down here, particulates are going to hit the wall. And this wall is also covered with mucus. All the way deep down into here, we have a mucus layer. So particulates, again, can get stuck there. You move them up towards the top of your throat, and you either spit it out or you swallow it. And then there's the right main bronchus. And then we have what are known as secondary bronchi, still fairly big. And then we move to tertiary bronchi. And then finally we get down to bronchioles. So again, as we've just said, we've got primary bronchi. We got 2 of those. And we only have 5 secondary bronchi, so not that many. You can see we're diverging, though. 18 to 20 tertiary bronchi. These are actually terminal bronchioles. I don't know why I didn't put that in there for you. But eventually we get down to the point where gas exchange can finally occur. That can start in the respiratory bronchioles and the alveolar ducts and the alveoli. Okay. Now, in order for gas exchange to occur, we've got to have 2 things. We've got to have thin walls that the gases can cross, and they can't do that here. Too thick. And we also have to have capillaries that, again, the gases can cross. And so those 2 things don't exist until we make it down as far as the respiratory bronchiole. And then it was just quick review. What do these upper respiratory tract tubes do? They conduct air deep into the lung, right? But they also filter air, they warm it, and they add water vapor, okay? But since no gas exchange is occurring up here, up above the respiratory bronchiole, we also refer to this part of the lung as the dead space. No gas exchange. No O2 moving from the air into the blood, no CO2 moving from the blood into the air. And so that's the upper part of that. Here you can see a little bit more detail on the branching. I'm not going to make you memorize this stuff. But we start, generation 0 just simply means that the trachea is not actually part of the lung. And so then we go down to the first generation, those 2 main bronchi, and then the lobar bronchi, and then segmental bronchi and bronchioles and terminal bronchioles. All right. And again, that is the conducting zone. No gas exchange, so it's a dead space. But we move down finally to the respiratory bronchioles, generation 17 to 19, alveolar ducts, 20 to 22, and finally the alveoli. And you have millions of these guys. Estimates put it at 3 to 800 million, so I'm not entirely exactly sure where that would be. It's going to partly depend on how big you are. An adult who's 5 foot tall is not going to have as many alveoli as an adult who's 6'10". An interesting thing here is to look. Generation 0 to 16 only has a volume of 150 milliliters. Relatively small, not even 0.2 of a liter. Look at generation 17 to 23. This is where gas exchange occurs. The respiratory zone greater than 5 liters of volume. Look at the comparison. Now, if we could take all of this and we could pull it out and flatten it out, we'd have a surface area of about 85 square meters, which is roughly 1/2 of a tennis court. A lot of area, Okay? All right, now we're going to go ahead and look at this. Well, what is this? Look at it, and I should have blanked this out for you, but you should say, oh yeah, that's the epithelium. What we see here is a pseudo-stratified ciliated epithelium. And then again, you can see these embedded goblet cells. They are what are responsible for producing this layer of mucus. Nice sticky mucus, so particulates will stick here. And then the cilia are constantly pumping and moving that stuff up towards the top of your throat as we do that. Okay? Well, in general, how do these epithelial membranes vary? Let's take a look at it. Well, we've already looked at the first part. Pseudostratified ciliated epithelium is found in the nasal cavity, but also those paranasal sinuses, the nasopharynx, the inferior larynx, the trachea, and also secondary bronchi. Now we change a little bit. We still have that mucus layer, still ciliated, but now it's simple columnar. And that's what we find in the tertiary bronchi and the large bronchioles. We keep getting a little bit thinner. Now we're down to simple ciliated cuboidal. So thinner, still ciliated, still a thin layer of mucus. And we find that in both terminal and also in the respiratory bronchioles. That's going to slow down the diffusion of O2 and CO2 across. So it won't happen as fast as it will happen across a simple squamous epithelium. Simple squamous is what we find for the alveolar ducts and also the alveoli. And then there is a very thin layer of mucus here, unless, again, you have something like bronchitis, itis, inflammation. The mucus is going to get thicker. Now, if you're having a bad asthma attack, the mucus can get thicker, and that too can interfere with diffusion of O2 and CO2 across. Now, we do have an exception. We find some non-keratinized, that's that tough protein that you find in the skin cells to make them stronger and make them water resistant, stratified squamous. And where is that found? Well, it's found in the oropharynx and the laryngopharynx and the superior part of the larynx. And that's because you've got food going down there, including things like potato chips, which you haven't chewed up completely and which can scratch those surfaces. And so we want to have multiple layers to protect the underlying tissue a little bit more. All right, again, looking at the gas exchange region. And so, number one, let me just point out to you, here's that terminal bronchiole right here. And now finally, we get to gas exchange here at the respiratory bronchiole. Now, what they've done is they've stripped away the capillaries. No capillaries, no gas exchange. I don't care how thin that wall is. And then finally, we move down into the alveoli and the alveolar ducts, which actually are what connect the alveoli to the rest of the lung, and that's a duct. Okay? And you have, again, 300 to 800 million of those, 70 to 85 square meters, depending on how big you are, and that's approximately the square footage of half a tennis court. And then surrounding these, you have like 1,000 miles of capillaries, and some people have said that that's analogous to taking a quart of milk and spreading it out over that entire half a tennis court. And so that's really, really, really going to help with diffusion of respiratory gases. Now remember, here's the pulmonary arteriole. Don't forget, we're in the pulmonary circuit. And so the blood in the arterioles is deoxygenated. but high in CO2. Now, the truth is that it's going to pick up oxygen really quickly. And so by the time it gets about a third of the way through, fully saturated, it should be bright red from here on out. And now we've got arterialized blood that's going out in the venule. Okay, arterialized just means it's holding as much oxygen as it can hold, and it's nice and low in CO2. Here's the duct, and so again you can see these alveoli are connected to that duct, and that will lead up to the respiratory bronchioles. Here's a micrograph. I think this is a scanning electron. There you can see an alveolus. The capillaries over the top have been damaged, so you can see it's nice and clear there. No gas exchange could occur there because no capillaries. But here you can see the rest of those alveoli are covered with capillaries, and so nice thin barrier. We'll look at that in the next video and see. Here again, we're inside. Which part of the circulation are we looking at? And so again, I hope you said, well, it's pulmonary. Okay, then what is this? The blue thing. And I think I screwed this up. Yeah, I did. Oh, well. I wanted to say this next. And so you should have said this is the pulmonary artery. It's bringing in blood from the right ventricle, which is low in O2, high in CO2. And then we go through the pulmonary capillaries, and that's where gas exchange occurs. And then these guys go back out to the left atrium, traveling through the pulmonary veins. And again, those veins are going to have arterialized blood. So now I want you to look carefully here. We're going to look at a couple of things. This is a part of the pulmonary artery. It's moving away from the heart, but it's low in oxygen. Now, look really carefully over here. See the little red ones? Bronchial arteries. Because again, remember, this is part of the systemic circuit. And this is responsible for serving cellular respiration of the cells of the lung. Okay? The other thing that you can see here is that these alveoli and the alveolar ducts have elastic fibers around them. A lot of elastin in there. That's that elastic protein. And so don't forget, what makes something elastic is not that it stretches, but that it recoils. And so when these elastin fibers recoil, they actually help to increase the pressure inside the alveoli and force air out when you exhale. And then the other thing that you notice here is smooth muscle. And the smooth muscle, if we make smooth muscle relax, we get bronchodilation. Easier to get air in and out. And if we have that smooth muscle contract, we get bronchoconstriction. Those of you who have asthma, here's the problem right here. The smooth muscle will spasm and we get bronchoconstriction, and it becomes particularly hard for you to exhale and get air out. You might think it's harder for you to get air in, but it's really harder to get it out. If you can't get it out as easily, then there's not as much space for a new breath of fresh air. And so that's what's going on there. And I thought I was going to say, and so the other thing that we find here on the smooth muscle is beta receptors. And so you use that inhaler that you have, and it's got an agonist of epinephrine, binds with the beta receptors, makes the smooth muscle relax, and you hope you get some bronchodilation. And that brings us to the end of video number 1. And so video number 2 will continue on with functioning of the pulmonary system.